What's up guys, my name is Robin and I make stuff, and today fall is in the air, Halloween's right around the corner, and my students have requested that we paint something that has to do with Halloween. So what better than a pumpkin? I mean, I could think of better things. We are doing a pumpkin. It's gonna be amazing. It should be very loose. We are going to talk about value. Should we paint the darks first, the lights first? What should we do first? We're gonna talk about lifting color. We're gonna talk about texture, some dry brushing. We're gonna talk about how to create a nice, clean, crisp edge around the shape of our pumpkin. It's gonna be amazing. This is my first time really painting a pumpkin, maybe second time, but that's okay, I'm not really counting. If you love hanging out with me, I love that for us. Let's do it again. So hit that subscribe button. Let's get to painting. Here's the reference photo that we are going off of today. We're going to figure out how we're gonna draw this on our paper. I like to use visual references, so the top of my paper and to the top of my pumpkin, maybe we figure out where the center is, which is the stem. And the top of the pumpkin comes a little bit higher than that, so a little bit higher than the middle of the page. I put a little mark there and kind of do the same thing for the bottom, about this far up from the bottom. Now I want to draw my pumpkin, kind of this weird, not completely circular shape. If you want to do circle, that's totally fine. I'm just going to lightly sketch this on here. Don't draw it really dark. Once you paint over your pencil lines, they're typically going to stay there, so I try to be conscious of that. Then we have these kind of like rounded egg-shaped looking things. So here's what I would suggest. I've got my weird funky pumpkin, and then I have the top part, you can kind of see onto the top of it. And then the stem comes up and kind of like wiggles around. And then, yes, I know there are these weird white branchy things. Look, those are supposed to be the dead vine branches. Don't ask questions, just go with it. So then we have this rounded kind of weird egg shape thing, and that one sits in the front. The other ones are going to follow that curve from the stem on the top to the bottom of the pumpkin. Essentially, it's going around and it's going to meet back on the bottom. You can kind of picture these egg shapes as if they're all just connected and there's one sitting behind the next one and one sitting behind the next one, etc. We don't want it to look flat. We want those shapes to look round. They also don't have to be perfect. They can be kind of funky, but we want to have that round shape. We're going to start with our darkest color first because I want to make a nice clean edge around this pumpkin. We're going to stop about halfway down and let the water kind of pull the rest of the color down. Ultramarine blue. I'm going to mix some alizarin crimson in there for a purple, and I'm using a lot of paint. This is like nice and thick. I want it to be really opaque. If I start putting a ton of water in there, it's going to get watered down. So instead, I'm going to do my wet paint onto my dry paper, and then I'm going to add water. I'm just kind of blobbing this on here while also being careful around where I have my stem. Then I just get some clean water and kind of dab that in there and use that clean water on my brush to help me spread that thick paint out. You could do wet on wet, but I really wanted to be able to see where my stem was and where my pumpkin is. And if I did wet on wet, I would put the water down first and have to be really careful around my stem. This way I can really see where the paint is going. So I'm adding my water as I go. I'm also adding some red in there. So wet on wet then at that point, because I've put wet paint onto my paper and then wet paint onto the wet paint that's then on my paper. Now I'm going to go around my little pumpkin shapes pretty loosely. Nothing real crazy or overly particular, just trying to make sure I leave some nice crisp edges there. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. How do we get those crisp edges and why are we doing that? So now I'm about halfway down my paper. What I want to do now is get some clean water on my brush, and I'm going to go into the bottom where I've painted that. Just let the water start to pull that down. Let's just be kind of loose with it, kind of sketchy. Let's get some clean water on our brush and do some splatter technique while the paint is still wet on the paper. This will create tiny little blooms. It's great for texture and just some added interest in the background. Now with yellow ochre, I'm going to put wet paint onto dry paper and then again add water. That will give me a nice crisp edge along the bottom of my pumpkin and just kind of softening it up with some water down there. And then we can tilt the board and let gravity kind of do some of its work and adding a little more water if you want. I'm actually going to put a roll of tape underneath my board so it has a little bit of tilt to it for the rest of the painting. And you'll see that it will start to just move down from the middle area. Crisp edges happen when we have enough paint. So crisp edge versus dry brushing. What's the best way to make it happen? You want to have enough paint on your brush. So paint and water. So if you have a lot of water but not enough paint, it's going to be a very light color. I have a lot of paint and a lot of water, and I'm using the thickest part of the brush to paint a nice round shape versus like the tip of my brush. You can do either, but for this we have a lot of area to cover. I really want to use the thickest part of my brush, pushing it down flat and really spreading out those bristles. Then from there, I can use either another color or just add some water to that top section, assuming that the bottom curves are where I need that crisp edge to be. And then I can kind of spread my paint out. You could just put more paint on there, but that's kind of how we get those nice crisp edges. Once the water and the paint is kind of out of our brush and we're not reloading it, it's going to be a very dry brush, which is how we get that kind of skipping little tiny dots. There's just not a lot of paint to move. Versus if I reload my brush, I can really spread that paint out. Our pumpkin's lightest color is going to be in these highlights. So we want sort of a light yellow, light orangey color, and then we want to pay attention to those lightest highlight areas and following the shape. So the front one is circular, the one on the right is more of like a curve. So when we paint that in, I want to leave that area open so that we can save that highlight. So we're going to mix up some nice light yellow, maybe a little bit of organic vermilion in there. We want to water it down so that we can see through the paint. It's very translucent. Let some of that white paper show through. That will give us a very light effect. If we start putting tons of paint in there, it's going to really fill up the paper. My background is dry. That is huge. If it's not dry and you start putting this color in here, it's going to hit that wet paint on the outside and pull those blues and those purples into your pumpkin, and we don't necessarily want that. We want that nice clean edge. I'm putting the majority of my paint around the outside, and then I soften up my paint with a little bit of water, and you can see sort of the lighter areas in the middle there. I have those two highlights. I want it to get darker as it goes around the pumpkin. If I were to paint over a highlight, for example, and want to bring it back, no problem. I'm just going to clean my brush out and lift that paint, clean the brush, lift the paint, clean the brush, lift the paint, clean the brush. Every time you're lifting paint out of your paper, it's like you're dipping your paintbrush into your palette, so keep that in mind. Your paintbrush is picking up paint, and if you don't want to spread the paint around, wipe it off on a paper towel. The next darkest color we have, I'm going to put a little bit more of that organic vermilion in here, a little bit more yellow, maybe just a little more paint overall. And we're going to start building these shadows up, kind of keeping the same concept. The darkest part of our pumpkin is going to be towards the back. I'm going to do the curves, the top curves, and then around the back, and just kind of following those top curves. We don't want to outline it. That's not what this is about. Sure, we could do that, but we're trying to suggest that there are some indentations. I'm just going to put some curves without fully meeting in the middle, and then with some clean water, let's just work that paint down a little bit so that it's lighter in the middle and the heaviest on the bottom. I'm going real sketchy. This pumpkin is kind of sketchy. We don't necessarily need it to be perfectly smooth. That's not the point of this. Our background's kind of crazy and sketchy, so our pumpkin can be crazy and sketchy. I have some dry brush going on in there, but again, trying to keep those highlights. I just don't want that highlight on the right to be the focus. It's really the one in the center that is the lightest. I'm using the curve of this pumpkin and following that as I soften this up. So let's talk about that for a minute. How do we do that? Well, if we have a really dark line, we want to maybe follow that line, keeping with the stroke and the shape of the direction or whatever it is that we're doing. I may have too much water in here, so I'll just clean my brush off, dry it off, and pick up some of that paint. But then moving along, you can see I'm going from top to bottom, nice long strokes. What we want to avoid, because we want it to be smooth like that, if you don't want it to be smooth, then just put your paint down and move it all over the place from left to right. It's going to be much more difficult to accomplish a smooth stroke that way versus if you follow the curve of that with your brush and using the thick side of your brush. You can see even that just helped smooth that out. All right, we're just building our dark. So the next darkest color, I don't know, somewhere in this dark red. I'm just kind of making this up as I go, you guys. So in this dark red area, we're going to just mix some more organic vermilion, maybe some burnt sienna in there, and kind of start building up these darks, following the curves. Again, if I put this on my paper and I'm like, oh gosh, it's a little bit too dark, that's not a problem. We can really soften it up. And it's okay if I'm putting this down, it's a little bit wet. If you find that's happening and you're putting your paint down and it's just going all over the place, don't hesitate to dry your painting off first. Mine's kind of staying put because I've dried it off enough. Focusing again my darks on the top and on the bottom of my pumpkin. My light is coming from the right-hand side, so that left-hand side of my pumpkin is going to be the darkest. I've now switched to a smaller round brush just to have some smaller strokes in there, maybe a little more sketchy. Adding some clean water to this. Every time my paintbrush disappears, I'm wiping it off with my paper towel. I pretty much hold that in my hand the entire time while I'm painting. Moving paint around, drying my brush off, moving paint around, drying my brush off. Really starting to get some deeper, darker values on that left-hand side, which is exactly what I want. So let's talk about the stem. We want to put some dark colors in there, but at first I'm going to paint the stem the lightest color, which we'll say is like a green, a bright green. And then the pieces that are kind of hanging out there, maybe they're kind of dried up, not as much life. So I put a little bit of light brown underneath there. And then at the base of the stem, while the stem is still wet, I'm just going to blop some dark color in there and hope that it kind of makes its way up that stem and softens itself on its own just a little bit. If it doesn't, you can kind of help it. I don't need to overwork it. I just need to kind of let it go. Here's where my paper dried, and you can kind of see those little starbursts. That's what happened when I flicked that clean water in there. Kind of cool. Lots of little blooms. It's kind of fun. Let's get darker. Let's talk about how we do some dry brushing. I've tried so hard to figure out how to tell people how to hold your brush. If you are holding your brush like this, the paint's going to run down and come to the tip of your brush, and you're just going to put paint on your paper. With dry brush, we want it to skip over the mountains and the valleys and the texture of the paper. If you've ever done a charcoal rubbing, you typically hold it like this, and then you rub it on the paper like that. We're not using the tip of our charcoal. That makes a fine line, and that's not what we're here to do. Let's think of our brush like a piece of charcoal. We're going to hold our brush just like our charcoal. You're going to hold it on your paper and rub it against your paper like this. We have a little bit of paint on here. That's our dry brush. And I've just got some organic vermilion on here and just starting to build those layers. That's all I'm really doing. Building layers, being a little messy about it, trying to find what colors are working, what textures are working, and, adding some yellows back in, adding some oranges, adding all these fun colors. This is painting. It should be really fun, and you can do some really neat stuff with watercolor. So don't be afraid. Don't overwork it. Make sure you do a little bit and then step back. You can see that the dark colors around the bottom have kind of softened up really nicely. So I have that middle section still is my lightest. So I'm really trying to be careful not to get rid of that. I feel like this pumpkin isn't like orange enough. We're gonna make some orange just using cadmium yellow and organic vermilion, and just try and put some orange color in here and really bump it up that it's a pumpkin. If you're looking at this thinking, that long stem thing is giving me onion vibes, Robin, you know what? I don't need your bad attitude. Just kind of adding those final touches, making sure it's dark in the top. Even lift some of the color out. So with a clean, sort of damp brush, we can lift those colors out, dry it off on a paper towel, and then come back. We're gonna paint the shadow on the bottom. So we need a nice dark color. It needs to have a lot of paint. So I'm using a lot of paint here. Ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, mixing those two together for my dark black. And we're just gonna go right in here, thinking about that crisp edge, defining those little bumps of our pumpkin, and then soften up the bottom, add a ton of water here. It's on a little bit of a slope. I've got that tape roll behind me, and just giving that water somewhere to run. And I also want to soften up the far edge just so it doesn't feel like it's sitting on a hill or something. And we'll let that bottom kind of soften and do what it's gonna do and not worry too much about it. Add a little more dark in here. When you're putting wet on wet, that water on your paper is going to lighten your paint. Using that dark color to just put some final dark touches in here, and really once you do those darks, it's gonna send it nice and moody. So with our stem, we want to put a few little details. Remember, the light is coming on the right hand side, which means the left hand side of the stem is going to be the darkest. Just putting a few little tiny stripes in there, leaving that right hand side a little more green, and maybe just a few on this left side, and we'll add some red, just a few little dots in here. The less perfect you try to make it, the more convincing it will be. If you're trying to make it real perfect and then you feel like, oh my gosh, this is not perfect, you might feel frustrated. So let's put some splatters in here. For splatters, I tell my students, hold your brush like this, like you're gonna play some drums, right? So you have your paintbrush like this, you have your finger out like this and you're gonna hit it on the side of your finger, right? If you're making a pot of something at home and you're stirring it up and then you whack it on the side of the pot, same concept. It doesn't work to hold it like this and try and bang it. There's not enough bounce in your paintbrush. If you hold it like this is how drummers hold their drumsticks. I am splattering all sorts of colors on here, yellow, some orange, some browns, and that will give it some nice texture, just sort of help tell you that it's a squash. It's been sitting out in a field and it's got imperfections, but we love it. Turned out pretty cool. I hope that you had a good time, and I will see you next time that I make stuff.